The day was crisp, with the icy fingers of winter wrapping tightly around the small town of Aspenwood, nestled in the shadow of the Montana Rockies. Sarah Walker, a solitary figure, stood at the edge of her kitchen window, sipping her morning coffee. As the steam from her mug twisted in the air, she surveyed the snow-covered wilderness, her mind drifting. Life in this small, remote town had always been calm, predictable. Yet, every once in a while, the forest outside seemed to pulse with an energy of its own, a force of nature that was both awe-inspiring and a little unnerving. Sarah, an experienced wildlife conservationist, had moved to Aspenwood years ago to escape the chaos of city life and embrace the peace of the wilderness. She spent her days tending to her small shop, where she sold local crafts, fresh produce, and supplies for adventurers braving the mountains. It was a quiet existence, but it suited her just fine. She had a special connection with the land, having grown up in a similar rural area, learning the ways of the forest from her father. Animals and nature were not just her work, but her passion. On this particular day, Sarah was on her way to the town's only grocery store when the sharp, desperate cry of an animal pierced the stillness of the woods. It was a sound that immediately stirred something deep inside her, a mix of fear, compassion, and an undeniable call to action. The cry echoed, twisting and turning in her chest, making her heart race. Without thinking, she turned off the main road, following the sound that seemed to come from the depths of the forest. As she navigated the snow-covered trail, Sarah's mind spun with possibilities. Was it a wolf in distress? A wounded deer? Or something more dangerous? The deeper she ventured, the colder the air became, biting at her exposed skin. Yet, despite the physical discomfort, her focus sharpened, and her steps grew more purposeful. She knew the forest like the back of her hand. But this was different. The cry was not one she had ever heard before, a primal sound that echoed through the trees, raw and filled with pain. When she finally reached the source of the cry, her breath caught in her throat. There, amidst the snow-drenched trees, was a grizzly bear. The enormous animal lay on its side, breathing heavily, its massive form trembling with every labored inhale. Its leg was caught in a bear trap, a cruel iron mechanism that had clamped down on its flesh. The bear's fur was matted with blood, its face contorted in pain, eyes wild with fear and frustration. Sarah's first instinct was to run. The bear was dangerous, one wrong move could mean certain death. But as her gaze locked with the bear's, something shifted. In that moment, she saw not a beast of the wilderness, but a creature in agony, trapped by circumstances beyond its control. There was an intelligence in its eyes, a recognition that reached across the divide between human and animal. Her heart broke at the sight, and without thinking, Sarah began to move toward the bear. The forest seemed to hold its breath as she approached. Despite the risk, there was no hesitation in her movements. She reached out, her voice soft and steady, speaking to the bear as though it could understand her. "I'm here to help," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You're going to be okay." She knew she couldn't leave the bear alone. She had no choice but to act. The knowledge that animals often succumb to injury in such circumstances was a weight she had carried for years. But this time was different. This bear was not just another creature in the wild, it was a living being in need, and Sarah had the power to make a difference. But as she moved closer, Sarah remembered the wisdom that had been passed down to her. Bears, especially grizzlies, were notoriously territorial and aggressive when threatened. This was no simple rescue mission, it was a battle between life and death. One where every move had to be calculated. She slowly knelt beside the bear, her hand trembling as she reached out to touch its fur. The bear growled low in its throat, but Sarah didn't flinch. She spoke softly to it, her voice a calming presence in the midst of its pain. "It's okay. I'm not here to hurt you. Just stay still. Let me help." Time seemed to stretch as Sarah worked with a sense of urgency. The bear's leg was in a vice-like grip, the trap nearly severing its limb. Sarah knew the longer she took, the more dangerous the situation would become. But there was no room for panic. She had dealt with animals in crisis before, though never anything quite like this. Every instinct in her told her to be gentle but firm, to avoid sudden movements but keep focused on the task. She carefully pried open the trap with a tool she always carried in her bag, her heart pounding in her chest as she worked. The bear's breathing grew more erratic, but it remained still. Perhaps out of sheer exhaustion, or maybe something more profound, a trust, unspoken but palpable. The trap finally released with a sharp snap, and Sarah let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The bear winced, its leg now free, but still dripping blood. Sarah quickly bandaged the wound as best as she could with the limited supplies she had. Her hands shook, not from fear but from the adrenaline coursing through her. She spoke to the bear the entire time, trying to reassure it, to let it know that it would survive. As the hours passed, the bear's condition stabilized. The animal, still weak but no longer in immediate danger, lay quietly while Sarah continued her care. She covered it with blankets, offering comfort in a world that could be so unforgiving. But as the sun began to dip behind the horizon, Sarah knew it was time to leave. The bear had been saved, for now, but the road to recovery was still uncertain. Before she left, she took one last look at the bear. It was lying peacefully now, its chest rising and falling in deep, steady breaths. There was a sense of quiet gratitude in its eyes, a flicker of understanding that Sarah could not fully explain. And with that, she turned and walked back toward town, her heart filled with a strange sense of peace. As Sarah walked back to the small town of Aspenwood, the cold air biting at her face, a strange sense of satisfaction settled over her. It wasn't that she had saved the bear for some grand purpose, she wasn't after glory or recognition. It was simply that she had listened, responded, and acted in the way the forest had taught her, with patience, care, and respect for the creatures that called it home. Her thoughts continued to swirl as she made her way through the village. Aspenwood had always been a place of peace, a quiet refuge from the hustle and bustle of the outside world. But today, it felt different. The town had its own rhythm, a calm hum that filled the spaces between the houses, the snow-capped rooftops, and the towering trees. But for the first time in years, Sarah felt a stirring beneath that surface, a quiet undercurrent of something more, something she couldn't name. It was almost as if the forest had reached out to her in a way it never had before, drawing her closer to something far bigger than herself. As she reached her cabin at the edge of the woods, Sarah's thoughts shifted back to the bear. She had left it in the forest, but she could feel its presence lingering with her. Something about the animal's resilience, the way it had trusted her in its moment of vulnerability, had left an imprint on her heart. It was as though the bear had allowed her to share in its pain, its struggle, and ultimately, its healing. That night, as Sarah prepared a simple meal of soup and bread, her mind wandered to the deeper connections she had with the natural world. Her father had always spoken of the sacredness of life, how every creature, no matter how small or fierce, had a role to play. He had taught her to see the world not just through human eyes, but through the eyes of every living being. It was a lesson Sarah carried with her, one that shaped her every action. She remembered the many times she had walked these woods with her father, feeling the quiet hum of life beneath the surface of the trees, the stones, and the earth itself. They had hunted together, yes, but they had also revered the animals they tracked, offering thanks for each life taken. It wasn't just about survival, it was about balance, respect, and understanding. As Sarah finished her meal and settled into her armchair by the fire, a knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She rose quickly, wiping her hands on her apron, and opened the door to find John Miller, a local hunter, standing on the other side. John was a familiar face in Aspenwood, a quiet man who spent most of his time in the woods, tracking game and collecting furs. He was an expert in survival, having lived in the wilderness for as long as anyone could remember. "Sarah," John said, his voice low and steady, "I heard about the bear. Is it okay?" Sarah nodded, motioning for him to come inside. John stepped in, brushing the snow off his boots and removing his thick fur-lined jacket. The warmth of the cabin greeted him like an old friend, and he let out a contented sigh. "It's healing," Sarah replied, her voice soft. "I don't know if it will make it, but it's alive. And that's something." John nodded gravely, his brow furrowing. "You're a brave woman, Sarah. Most would have stayed away, not risked it with a bear like that. But you did what needed to be done." Sarah smiled faintly, though there was no pride in her expression. "I couldn't leave it. Not after everything I've learned from this place. From my father." John tilted his head slightly, his gaze softening. "I know what you mean. Sometimes it feels like the forest talks to us, doesn't it? Like it's telling us what's right, what needs to happen." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the crackling of the fire in the hearth and the steady patter of snow against the windows. Outside, the world seemed to pause, caught in the stillness of winter's embrace. Finally, John broke the silence. "Do you think it'll come back to the forest? Or will it stay?" Sarah shook her head. "I don't know. It's not just about healing physically. It's about finding its place again, a place where it can live without fear, without pain. That's what we all need, really. A place to belong." John was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. "You've got a good heart, Sarah. You always did. I think that's why the forest listens to you." As Sarah watched him leave, she couldn't help but feel a stirring deep within her chest. John's words resonated in a way she couldn't quite explain. The forest had listened to her, yes, but it was also a reflection of something greater, a connection that transcended the human world. In helping the bear, Sarah hadn't just healed an animal, she had healed a part of herself that she didn't even know was broken. The next few days were a blur of activity. Sarah continued her daily routine, tending to the shop, caring for the animals in the village, and managing the small garden behind her cabin. But as the days passed, she found herself thinking more and more about the bear. Had it returned to the forest? Was it finding its way back to its home? Or had the injury been too much for it to overcome? She couldn't shake the feeling that there was something unfinished about the situation. The bear had survived, but the journey toward healing was far from over. It wasn't just the bear that needed to heal, it was everything in the forest, everything in the town, including Sarah herself. One afternoon, as Sarah ventured into the woods to gather herbs, she heard the sound of footsteps behind her. At first, she thought it was just the wind playing tricks, but then the steps grew louder, closer. She turned around, and to her surprise, she saw the bear emerging from the trees. Its eyes were calm now, no longer wild with pain, but filled with a quiet wisdom that Sarah recognized immediately. The bear was no longer the wounded creature she had rescued, it was whole again, standing tall and proud in the heart of the forest. It had found its way back to the life it had known before the trap, and in doing so, it had brought something back to Sarah too. For a long moment, the two of them stood there, locked in an unspoken understanding. The bear didn't need Sarah to rescue it anymore, it had rescued itself, finding strength not in its own power, but in the connection it had with the world around it. And in that moment, Sarah realized that the forest had been right all along. Healing, true healing, came not just from fixing what was broken, but from learning to live again, whole and unafraid. As the bear disappeared into the woods, Sarah felt a sense of peace wash over her. The forest, like the bear, had found its balance once more. And Sarah, too, had found hers. Sarah felt a deep sense of connection as the days passed, knowing the bear was out there in the wild, its strength restored, living freely once again. But that night, a new feeling crept into her heart. It wasn't loneliness, nor was it fear, but a quiet sense of responsibility that filled the empty space. The forest had always been a part of her. But now it felt more like a part of her story, her journey, a journey that was still unfolding. The woods outside Aspenwood were always alive with sounds, the rustle of leaves, the call of birds, and the whisper of the wind in the trees. But in the days following her encounter with the bear, everything seemed amplified. The forest was speaking to her, as it had always done, but now its voice was louder, clearer, as if it had been waiting for her to listen more deeply. Sarah began to take longer walks, venturing further into the woods than she ever had before. Each step seemed to bring new discoveries, new lessons. One morning, as she walked along the familiar trail near the riverbank, she noticed something unusual: tracks in the snow. Fresh and wide. They were bear tracks, unmistakable in their size and shape. Her heart skipped a beat. Was it the same bear? Or had it been joined by others? Her curiosity led her to follow the tracks, her boots crunching through the snow with every step. The trail twisted and turned through the trees, leading her deeper into the forest than she had ever ventured before. The path felt unfamiliar, yet somehow welcoming, as if the forest was guiding her. The further she walked, the more she felt a strange pull, a sense of purpose. The tracks seemed to guide her, almost as if they knew where she needed to go. And then, as if answering her unspoken question, she found herself in a small clearing, one she had never seen before. In the center of the clearing stood a towering oak tree, its branches stretching wide, almost as if reaching out to embrace the sky. The tree was ancient, its bark weathered and knotted with age. Beneath it, in the soft earth, lay a small patch of flowers, delicate white blooms that seemed to glow in the winter light. The clearing felt sacred, untouched by the outside world. It was there that she saw it, a bear, sitting quietly by the base of the oak tree. It was the same bear, she could tell by the markings on its fur. But it seemed different now. It was no longer the wounded creature she had rescued, it was regal, powerful, and at peace. For a long moment, Sarah simply watched, captivated by the scene before her. The bear didn't move, didn't acknowledge her presence. It simply sat, its gaze steady and serene, as though it had found its place in the world. In that moment, Sarah understood. The forest, the bear, and everything that lived within it were all part of something larger than she could fully comprehend. It wasn't just about survival, nor was it just about healing. It was about harmony, the kind of harmony that could only come when every creature, every plant, and every person found their rightful place in the world. The bear's calmness seemed to radiate outward, filling the clearing with an energy that Sarah could feel deep within her bones. She took a slow step forward, not wanting to disturb the delicate balance, but also needing to be closer, to feel the power of the moment. The bear's eyes flicked toward her, and for the first time since their encounter, they met her gaze. There was no fear in the bear's eyes. No aggression. Only a quiet understanding. And in that instant, Sarah felt something shift within herself. The feeling she had been carrying for days, that sense of responsibility, was replaced with something more profound. She realized that she wasn't just a visitor to this land, she was a part of it, just as the bear was. The forest had chosen her, not to protect it, but to be a part of its story. To walk alongside it, and to understand the deeper currents of life that flowed through every living thing. The bear stood then, its powerful frame moving with grace, and turned toward the trees. Without a backward glance, it disappeared into the woods, leaving Sarah standing alone in the clearing, her heart full and her mind clearer than it had ever been. In the weeks that followed, Sarah continued her walks, but now with a deeper sense of purpose. She no longer felt the need to prove herself to anyone, nor did she need to rescue anything. She simply walked, listened, and connected. The forest had a rhythm, a pulse, and she had learned to move with it, not against it. The townspeople began to notice a change in Sarah. She seemed more grounded, more at peace with herself. She still tended to her shop and helped the animals, but there was something different about her, something more open, more receptive to the world around her. People began to seek her out, not just for her knowledge of the woods, but for her wisdom, her quiet strength, and the peace that seemed to radiate from her. One evening, as Sarah sat by the fire, she thought back on her journey. It had begun with a wounded bear, a creature in need of help, but it had led her to something much greater. The healing she had sought for the bear had also healed her own spirit, revealing the deeper truths of life, of connection, and of balance. As she gazed into the flames, Sarah realized that her journey was far from over. The forest would always be there, with its lessons and its mysteries, but now she was no longer an outsider, a mere observer. She was a part of it, woven into its very fabric, and the story of the bear, the story of healing, of connection, and of living in harmony with the world, was her story too. And as the fire crackled, she knew that, just like the bear, she had found her place in the world. As Sarah spent more time in the woods, the winter months began to pass in a blur of serenity. The world around her had settled into a delicate, quiet rhythm. However, not all was as peaceful as it seemed. The deeper she walked into the forest, the more she noticed changes, subtle at first, but undeniable. The weather had shifted. Winter had lingered longer than usual, the cold biting through the air with an intensity she hadn't felt in years. The trees, though still standing strong, appeared to be buckling under the weight of the snow. The ground beneath her feet seemed harder, more brittle, and even the rivers ran slower, their currents fighting the ice that slowly crept in. One morning, as Sarah walked to the riverbank, she noticed that something was amiss. The river, which had always been full of life, now seemed still. The usual chorus of frogs and birds was absent, leaving behind a silence that weighed heavily on her. The water was dark, sluggish, almost reluctant to flow. And she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She followed the river upstream, trying to trace the source of the disturbance. As she walked, she noticed more signs of change. Trees that had once stood tall were now bent, their branches drooping under the weight of the unusual weather. The forest was showing signs of strain. Something was affecting the delicate balance that had once been so perfect. It wasn't long before Sarah stumbled upon something far more unsettling. A section of the forest, once vibrant with life, had been ravaged. Trees lay fallen, their trunks shattered, their roots exposed as though something massive had torn through the land. The ground was scarred, and the air felt heavy with tension. Sarah's heart sank. She knew this wasn't a natural event. This destruction wasn't caused by the usual storms or avalanches. It felt as though something deliberate had shattered the peace of the forest, and with it, the balance she had worked so hard to find. The bear. Sarah's first thought was of the bear she had helped, the creature that had become her guide. She hadn't seen it in weeks, but now, as if answering her unspoken question, a figure appeared at the edge of the clearing. The bear. But this time, it was not alone. A second bear emerged from the trees, its fur thick and dark, with eyes full of fire. This bear was different. There was an aggression in its stance, a tension in the air that made Sarah step back instinctively. She had never seen this bear before, but it was clear that it was not the peaceful creature she had once known. The bond she had felt with the original bear was now clouded by a new, unfamiliar energy. The two bears stood facing each other, the larger one pacing back and forth while the smaller one, Sarah's bear, stood resolute. There was a palpable energy between them, an ancient tension that felt like a storm gathering on the horizon. For a moment, Sarah could only watch as the two creatures regarded each other. Their bodies tensed, ready for something that neither could avoid. The forest seemed to hold its breath as the silence stretched on, the only sound the distant rustle of the trees. It was as if the earth itself was waiting for a signal, a sign of which direction the balance would tip. Then, without warning, the larger bear charged, its massive body moving with a terrifying speed. The smaller bear, despite its size, met the charge head-on, its claws flashing in the light. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest as she watched the two creatures clash, their strength and fury tearing through the silence of the forest. She wanted to intervene. She wanted to stop the violence before it escalated further. But as she stepped forward, the bear she had helped, the one that had once trusted her, turned its gaze toward her. There was something in its eyes, a message she couldn't ignore. It wasn't fear, nor was it anger. It was a warning. This was not her fight. And in that moment, Sarah understood. This conflict was a part of something greater, something far older than the forest itself. It was the cycle of life, of power, survival, and dominance, playing out in the wild. She had stepped into the story of the forest, but she was not the one who could decide how it would unfold. For hours, the battle raged between the two bears, and Sarah stood by. Helpless. The forest was no longer the place of quiet harmony it had once been. The winds had changed, and the world she had known was shifting. But just as the larger bear seemed to overpower the smaller one, something shifted within the forest itself. The trees seemed to groan, and the air became thick with energy. It was as if the very earth was intervening, refusing to allow the balance to be tipped so easily. The larger bear hesitated, its eyes darting to the trees around it. The smaller bear took advantage of the moment, striking with a power Sarah had never seen before. It was a move driven by desperation. But it was enough. The larger bear stumbled back, wounded, and with a final, furious roar, it fled into the woods. The smaller bear stood victorious, its body heaving with the exertion of the fight. Sarah could see the marks of battle on its fur, but it was still standing, still strong. It turned to her once more, its eyes softening as it met her gaze. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the bear turned and disappeared into the trees, leaving Sarah alone in the clearing once more. She stood there, stunned by the events that had unfolded before her. The storm that had come to the forest had passed. But the world around her had changed. The peace she had once known was no longer certain. The balance of the forest had been disturbed, and Sarah was left to wonder how much of that disturbance was connected to her own presence in this sacred space. As Sarah made her way back home, her mind raced with the events of the day. What had driven the larger bear to challenge the smaller one? And what did it mean for the forest? She had thought she had understood the balance of nature, the deep connection between all living things. But now, she wasn't so sure. The storm had passed, but Sarah could feel another one on the horizon, one that would challenge not just the forest, but the very way she viewed her place within it. The next chapter of her journey was about to begin, and it was one she had never anticipated. The story of Sarah and the two bears highlights several deep humanistic lessons. Balance and harmony. Nature's balance, though delicate, is powerful. When disrupted, it can lead to conflict, forcing one to reassess their place in the world. Acceptance and non-interference. Sometimes, stepping back and allowing events to unfold as they are meant to is the wisest choice, especially when facing forces greater than ourselves. Inner strength. Sarah's journey teaches that true strength is not in control, but in understanding and respecting the forces at play, both within us and in the world around us. Interconnection. Every living being is connected. What happens to one part of the world affects the whole, and we must all be mindful of our impact. If you enjoyed this story and found value in its lessons, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more content that will inspire, uplift, and deepen your understanding of life's most profound moments. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an update. Together, let's continue exploring the wisdom that connects us all. Thank you for your support.